A man in Houston picked up a phone and asked a power plant in California to switch itself off. The plant was working perfectly. That was the point. He needed the operator to invent a reason. Call it maintenance. Call it a forced outage. Whatever would look plausible on paper. The recording survives. He asks the man to get a little creative and come up with a reason to go down, and the operator understands him immediately. You can hear them both laughing. It was the summer of 2000, and California was in a heat wave. Over the months that followed, the lights went out across that state again and again. Hospitals ran on generators. Traffic signals died in the middle of major cities, and every time the supply got tighter, the price of the electricity these men controlled went up. Then a wildfire took out a transmission line, and one of them sang about it on a recorded company phone. "Burn, baby, burn," he says, calls it a beautiful thing. Those men were not criminals working out of a basement. They sat on a trading floor in a 50-story glass tower in downtown Houston, and they worked for the company that Fortune magazine had just named America's most innovative company. For the 6th year running, 6 consecutive years, this company was voted the most forward-thinking, most brilliantly run business in the United States. Harvard Business School taught it as a case study in reinvention. It was the 7th largest company in America by revenue. Its logo, a crooked tilted E, was the last thing Paul Rand ever designed, the man who gave America the IBM and UPS marks. It hung on the side of that tower and on the side of a brand new Major League Baseball stadium. The company was Enron. 15 months after that fire, it was gone. Not restructured, gone. $63.4 billion in assets, wiped out in the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history to that point. A stock that traded at $90.75 a share ended at 26 cents. Roughly 20,000 people lost their jobs, and a great many of them lost their retirement savings in the same week, because the company had spent a decade encouraging them to put those savings into its own stock. Congressional investigators put the damage to employees and retirees somewhere north of $1 billion. Enron's own executives had quietly sold more than $1 billion of stock on the way up. An accounting firm founded in 1913, with 85,000 employees across 84 countries, was destroyed alongside it. And none of what you just heard is the reason Enron collapsed. The California money was real money. Those were some of the best quarters in the company's history. Enron did not die because of anything happening on that trading floor. Enron died because of a single decision made in 1990, in a conversation about accounting, that handed this company the ability to report profits that did not exist. It used that ability for 11 years, in public, in documents filed with the federal government, while one of the 5 largest accounting firms in the world signed off every quarter, and Wall Street analysts who could not explain the business told the public to buy. The mechanism takes about 4 minutes to understand, and once you understand it, you will start seeing it in companies that are trading right now. This story ends with 2 of the most powerful executives in America walking into a federal courtroom in Houston. A jury found one of them guilty on 10 separate counts. Today, in the official records of the United States government, that man has no criminal history at all. He was not acquitted, and nobody pardoned him. His conviction was erased by a legal doctrine almost nobody outside the profession has heard of. That is not the twist you are expecting. Chapter 1. The Preacher's Son. To understand how the lie got built, you have to understand the man who built the place it lived in. He did not start out as a villain. He started out as a poor kid in the middle of nowhere who wanted, badly, to matter. Kenneth Lee Lay was born in 1942 in Tyrone, Missouri, a farming community so small that calling it a town is generous. His father ran a store, sold stoves and farm equipment, and preached. The preaching was never the part that paid. There's a story Lay told about himself for decades, and he told it well, because it was true and because it was useful. As a boy, he drove a tractor across a hayfield and daydreamed about the world of business and industry that existed somewhere far away from that field. He got out through school, and he got out fast. Economics degrees from Missouri, a doctorate from the University of Houston, 3 years as a corporate economist at the company that would become Exxon, a stint at the Pentagon studying military procurement, and then the piece that matters most. A job in Washington in the early 1970s, first at the Federal Power Commission, then as Deputy Undersecretary for Energy at the Department of the Interior. That's where Ken Lay learned the idea that would define the rest of his life. He learned how energy regulation actually worked in America, and he became convinced it was broken. Natural gas was then one of the most tightly controlled commodities on Earth. The government set the price at the wellhead. Pipelines were regulated monopolies that bought gas at fixed prices and sold it at fixed prices to utilities in fixed territories. There was no market, there was a schedule. Lay believed that system was strangling the country. He wasn't alone. Fixed prices meant producers had no incentive to drill, which meant shortages, which meant more rules, which made everything worse. In the late 1970s, America had genuine gas shortages. Schools closed. Factories shut down in winter. So Lay became a true believer in deregulation. And this is worth holding on to for the next 2 hours, because the record supports it. At the beginning, he was right. Deregulating natural gas is, in the judgment of most economists who have assessed it since, a policy that worked. Ken Lay didn't come to Houston with a scheme. He came with a thesis. He left government, moved fast through 2 pipeline companies, and in 1984 took over a mid-sized outfit called Houston Natural Gas. 42 years old, a doctorate in economics, a stint running a piece of the federal energy bureaucracy, and a theory about the future of an entire industry. He was about to get the chance to test it at a scale nobody expected, including him. Chapter 2. The Merger That Shouldn't Have Worked. In 1985, Houston Natural Gas merged with a much larger Nebraska pipeline company called Internorth. On paper, Internorth swallowed Houston Natural Gas. Internorth was bigger. It paid a premium of $2.3 billion. Its chairman ran the combined business, and the head office was supposed to stay in Omaha. Within a year, none of that was true. Lay had negotiated a contract making him chairman and chief executive if the incumbent left, and the incumbent left within 6 months, worn down by a board fight and a corporate raider circling the company. The headquarters moved to Houston. The Omaha executives were pushed out or resigned in disgust. A Nebraska pipeline concern became, in under 18 months, a Texas empire run by a man who had never run a company that size. There's a detail from this period that people love, and it's true. The merged company needed a name. A consulting firm was paid a fortune and came back with Enron. It got printed on annual report drafts before someone pointed out that Enron is a biological term for the digestive tract. They dropped 2 letters, Enron. Underneath the naming comedy was a problem that shaped everything after it. The merger had loaded the new company with debt. To fight off the raider, they'd bought back stock. To finance the deal, they'd borrowed heavily. Enron came out of it carrying somewhere between $3 and $4.5 billion against an equity base that couldn't support it. The rating agencies were watching. The company was over-levered from birth, and it turned to the junk bond market to stay funded. Line up everything this company did over the following 16 years in chronological order, and a reading suggests itself. Enron's original sin was not fraud, it was debt. Every scheme this company ever invented, every partnership, every special purpose entity, every accounting maneuver you're about to learn about, was in service of one goal: keep debt off the balance sheet so the credit rating wouldn't slip, so the stock wouldn't fall, so the company could keep borrowing. Which points to a different description of this company than the usual one. Enron doesn't look like a healthy business that got greedy and started lying. On the available record, it looks more like a company that was structurally fragile from the day it was born, and that spent 16 years getting better at concealing it. Meanwhile, Lay's thesis was paying off. Deregulation accelerated. Pipelines that had been dumb tubes carrying gas at fixed prices became routes across a live market where prices moved every day. Enron owned the largest natural gas pipeline network in North America, roughly 37,000 miles of it, which put the company in the middle of a market that had just been switched on. For the first few years, nobody at Enron had a good answer for what to do with that position. They were about to be handed one by a 36-year-old consultant from Chicago who had never worked a day in the energy industry. But before Jeff Skilling, there was an incident in a small office in Valhalla, New York, that told everyone exactly what kind of company Ken Lay was going to run. Almost nobody remembers it. It is the single most important warning sign in this entire story. Chapter 3. Valhalla. In the mid-1980s, Enron ran a small oil trading operation out of a nondescript office in Valhalla, New York, about 30 miles north of Manhattan. Enron Oil. A handful of employees, and by a wide margin the most profitable thing the company owned. It was run by a trader named Louis Bourget, with a treasurer named Thomas Mastroeni, and their numbers were extraordinary. Quarter after quarter, Valhalla printed money. Ken Lay praised them publicly. They were held up internally as proof that Enron could compete in sophisticated markets and not just move gas through tubes. In 1987, two Enron auditors in Houston noticed something odd. Money was moving through a bank account in New York that didn't appear in the company's records. They flew up, looked at the books, and found transactions routed through accounts nobody in Houston had authorized. Confronted, Mastroeni produced bank statements that had been physically doctored to hide the transfers. The auditors flew back and told senior management that the two men running Enron's most profitable division were moving company money into accounts they controlled. What happened next is the hinge of this entire story. Enron's internal auditors recommended the traders be fired immediately. Ken Lay did not fire them. Instead, a telex went from Houston up to Valhalla, telling the two of them to please keep making us millions. That line is one of the most quoted in the whole Enron literature, and the attribution matters. Some accounts put the words in Ken Lay's mouth directly. Others attribute the specific message to Enron's then-president. What is not in dispute is the decision it communicated, and whose decision it was. Lay ran the company, Lay chaired the meeting, and the reasoning he reportedly gave was that Valhalla was the only part of the merged business making real money. The board was told the matter was handled. Bourget and Mastroeni kept their jobs, kept trading, and by some accounts had their limits raised. The auditor who pushed hardest for their removal was, in short order, no longer working on the account. There is a defense of this decision. Valhalla was generating a huge share of Enron's earnings at a moment when the company was drowning in merger debt, and a downgrade could have been fatal. Lay may have genuinely believed the accounting issue was a technicality, and the profits were real. They were not real. What Houston did not understand was that Bourget's spectacular consistency was itself the tell. Oil trading does not produce smooth, reliable, quarter-after-quarter profits. Markets don't work that way, which points to the inference Enron's own auditors reached at the time and put in front of the board. The smoothness wasn't evidence of skill. It was evidence of manipulation. Bourget had been shifting losses between accounting periods to manufacture the appearance of steady performance, and the real position underneath had grown enormous. Later that year, it detonated. Enron's traders had taken a massive bet on oil prices with no meaningful limits, and when the market moved against them, the company was exposed to losses estimated in the hundreds of millions. An executive named Mike Muckleroy was sent to New York to unwind the position, and through a mix of bluffing the market and brutal luck, he got the damage down to somewhere around $140 million. 9 figures, in 1987, in a company that had never been more than a quarter away from a credit crisis. Bourget served a prison term. Mastroeni received a considerably lighter sentence. Enron survived, barely. And then Enron learned nothing. Or rather, watch what the company does over the next 14 years, and you can make a strong case it learned the wrong lesson. Not that this must never happen again, but something closer to when trading produces spectacular numbers. Don't ask questions you don't want the answer to. We can't read Ken Lay's mind here. What we can do is note that at the very first ethical test of his career, presented with a clear choice between the earnings and the mechanism producing them, he chose the earnings. And then count how many times that same choice recurs. 14 years later, when a vice president walked into his office with a memo saying the company was going to implode in a wave of accounting scandals, he would make precisely the same call, for precisely the same reason. Valhalla was the dress rehearsal, and into this company, leveraged, forgiving of its own star performers, hungry for a story to tell Wall Street, walked a consultant with an idea that would make all of it possible. Chapter 4. The Consultant. Jeffrey Keith Skilling was born in Pittsburgh in 1953. He was, by every account including his own, the smartest person in almost every room he entered from adolescence onward. He knew it. He did not consider that arrogance. He considered it data. He went to Southern Methodist University on a scholarship, then to Harvard Business School, where he graduated in the top few % of his class. The anecdote that follows him everywhere comes from that admissions process. Asked whether he was smart, he is said to have replied that he was extremely smart, with an expletive attached. That one is anecdote rather than fact, repeated constantly, sourced thinly, and disputed by his defenders for 20 years. It survives mostly because it rhymes with everything about him that is documented. What is documented is the worldview. He believed markets were the most efficient structure ever discovered, and that almost any problem could be turned into a market if you were clever enough about how you defined it. He joined McKinsey and rose fast, becoming one of the youngest partners in the firm's history. In the late 1980s, McKinsey assigned him to a client in Houston. The problem Enron brought him was real and specific. Deregulation had created a natural gas market, and that market was chaos. Before deregulation, if you were a chemical plant or a power utility, you signed a long-term contract at a regulated price and knew what your gas would cost for years. After deregulation, prices moved, sometimes violently. Theoretically efficient, practically terrifying. Utilities didn't want to build $1 billion power plant on the basis of a fuel price that might triple. On the other side, producers had the mirror image. Banks wouldn't lend them money to drill, because nobody could tell the bank what the gas would sell for. Buyers who wanted price certainty and couldn't get it. Sellers who wanted capital and couldn't get it. Both frozen. Skilling's answer, presented in 1989, was one of the genuinely great ideas in the history of American energy. He called it the gas bank. Enron steps into the middle. Enron signs long-term contracts with hundreds of producers to buy their gas, giving them the predictable revenue they need to get bank loans. At the same time, Enron signs long-term contracts with hundreds of buyers to deliver gas at a fixed guaranteed price, giving them the certainty they need to build. Enron pockets the spread and manages the risk across the whole portfolio, the way a bank manages loans and deposits. Gas stops being a physical commodity you push through a tube. It becomes a financial instrument you trade, hedge, package, and sell. It worked beautifully. Within a few years, Enron was the dominant buyer and seller of natural gas in North America, and the model changed how the entire industry operated. If Jeff Skilling had done nothing else in his career, he would still merit a chapter in any honest history of American energy markets. Enron wanted him. Rich Kinder, Enron's president, asked him to come and run it in-house, and Skilling turned him down flat. Things were going well at McKinsey. Kinder kept at him. Lay kept at him. In the spring of 1990, he finally agreed. He said yes with one condition. He would build the gas bank, but only if the new business was allowed to use a specific accounting method. He later described it as the issue he'd lie across the railway tracks over. He told Lay, in plain terms, that without it he wasn't coming. Lay agreed. That single accounting method is the lie in the title of this video. Everything else runs downstream of it. It isn't complicated. Companies want you to think this stuff is complicated. It isn't. Chapter 5. The Machine That Printed Profit. The method is called mark-to-market. You sign a contract today to supply a power plant with natural gas every month for the next 20 years. Over those 20 years, you expect to collect $2 billion, and you expect it to cost you $1.5 billion to source and deliver the gas. So the contract, if everything goes to plan, will earn you $500 million. Under traditional accounting, the boring conservative 100-year-old method, you report a slice of that profit each year as it actually arrives. $25 million a year for 20 years. Cash comes in, you book the profit. Slow, honest, and checkable. Under mark-to-market, you estimate the total value of that contract over its whole life and book the profit immediately. All $500 million. Today, this quarter, before a single molecule of gas has moved and before a single dollar has changed hands. That's the trick. All of it. And Enron's defenders are right to insist on this next part. Mark-to-market is not inherently fraudulent, and it was not Jeff Skilling's invention. Banks and investment firms use it legitimately every day. What was novel about Enron was never the tool. It was where the tool got pointed. Because the method only works honestly when the asset has a real, observable market price. If you own 1,000 shares of a public company, marking them to market is trivially easy. You look up the price. Everyone sees the same number. Enron was not marking shares to market. Enron was marking to market the estimated profitability of 20-year energy contracts, in markets that in some cases did not yet exist. So who decided what a 20-year contract was worth? Enron did. Enron built the model and chose the assumptions. What gas prices would do over 2 decades, what interest rates would do, what demand would do, what discount rate to apply. Move one assumption by a fraction of a percent, and the profit on day one shifts by tens of millions. The company that got to report the profit was the same company that got to calculate the profit. Enron took its case to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and here the language matters more than most people notice. The SEC did not exactly approve it. On January 30, 1992, the Commission wrote to say it would not object to Enron using mark-to-market accounting from that year onward. A non-objection, that is the entire regulatory foundation of everything that follows. When the letter arrived, Skilling gathered his people in a conference room and brought out champagne. Champagne, to celebrate an accounting change. They knew exactly what they'd been handed. Because there's a second half to this, and it's uglier than the first. Once you book a contract's entire 20-year profit on day one, that contract is finished for accounting purposes. It has already given you everything it will ever give you. Next quarter, it produces nothing. So to show growth next quarter, and this is a public company whose stock price depends entirely on showing growth, you have to sign more contracts, bigger ones, longer ones. And the quarter after that, bigger still. Enron had built a business model that mathematically required permanent acceleration, not permanent success. Permanent acceleration, a year in which Enron merely repeated the previous year's deal flow, would look, in its own financial statements, like collapse. There was a third problem too, the quietest and most lethal of the three. Mark-to-market profits are not cash. You've booked $500 million of earnings and received nothing. You'll report record profits to Wall Street. Your stock will rise. Your executives will collect bonuses calculated on those profits, bonuses paid in real money, and meanwhile the actual bank account is going out rather than coming in, because you spent real cash to build the pipeline the contract runs through. Enron's reported earnings and Enron's cash flow began to separate almost immediately. They never came back together. Not once, in the entire history of the modern company. That gap, between what Enron said it earned and what Enron actually collected, is Enron. Everything else in this story is an attempt to conceal the size of it. Which raises the obvious question. Where were the auditors? They were on the 18th floor. Arthur Andersen didn't just audit Enron. Andersen had a permanent office inside Enron's headquarters. Its people had Enron email addresses, went to Enron's parties, played on Enron's intramural teams. The money is the part you can't unsee. In the year 2000, Andersen billed Enron roughly $25 million for auditing and roughly $27 million for consulting. The firm made more money advising Enron than checking Enron. It was, functionally, paid more to help than to police. Ask yourself what happens to the partner who tells a client like that no. Chapter 6. Rank and Yank. If mark-to-market was the mechanism, the culture was the engine. Skilling built that culture on purpose, from a philosophy he stated openly and never disguised. He believed people were motivated by money. Not primarily. Exclusively. He said versions of this in interviews, to journalists, on stage. It wasn't a secret doctrine, it was the mission statement. So he built a company designed to select for it. Enron recruited relentlessly from the top MBA programs on a specific pitch. You will not be judged on seniority or industry background or how long you've been here. You'll be judged on results. Immediately. And if you're good, You can run a business unit with $100 million behind it before you turn 30. For an ambitious 26-year-old in 1996, this was intoxicating, and Enron delivered. People genuinely did get handed enormous authority almost immediately. The average age in some trading groups was under 30. Traders in their 20s were making seven-figure bonuses. The enforcement mechanism was called the Performance Review Committee. Everyone at Enron called it something shorter: rank and yank. Twice a year, every employee was ranked 1 to 5 on a forced curve, with managers required to place a fixed percentage of their people in the bottom category, regardless of how those people had actually performed. Time reported the distribution from inside the company in June 2001, while the system was still running. 5% superior, 30% excellent, 30% strong, 20% satisfactory, and 15% marked as needing improvement. One detail in the popular version is wrong. It's often said that a bottom rating gave you 2 weeks to find another job inside Enron. The contemporaneous reporting says 6 months. Get back to standard in that window, or leave. Still brutal, just not quite as cinematic. If you managed 10 brilliant people who all exceeded their targets, you still had to designate 1 or 2 as failures. Every 6 months. Forever. Enron did not invent this. Forced ranking was spreading fast through corporate America, and General Electric, Ford, and Microsoft all ran versions of it. What made Enron's version lethal wasn't the curve, it was what the curve was measuring. First, it meant your colleagues were not your colleagues. They were the people standing between you and the bottom of the curve. Enron's own employees described a floor where information got hoarded, where people withheld help, where deals were sabotaged internally, because a peer's failure was quite literally your survival. Second, and far more consequentially, the review ran overwhelmingly on reported earnings, not cash collected, not whether the deal actually worked. Reported earnings, which under mark-to-market meant the number your own model produced on the day you signed. Enron had created a system where an employee's pay, promotion, and continued employment depended on a profit figure that employee had substantial influence over calculating, with no consequence 6 months later when the deal turned out to be worthless. By then the bonus was paid, the ranking was locked, and the person had usually been promoted onto something bigger. There's a phrase in economics for what Enron built. It privatized the gains and socialized the losses, internally, among its own staff. The optimist got rich. The realist got a 5. Which brings us to the thing that made all of it self-sealing. What happened, in that environment, to the person who raised a hand in a meeting and said the assumptions weren't defensible? Here the evidence is testimonial rather than documentary. Nobody wrote "ask too many questions" on a review form, and no such form would survive if they had. But the accounts former employees gave to investigators, to Congress, and to reporters converge hard on one point. They got rated a 5. Skepticism read as negativity, negativity read as weakness, and weakness got you ranked. Enron had engineered an organization in which internal criticism was professionally fatal, which is why, when this company came apart, the most common reaction from people who'd worked there was not that they had no idea. It was that they knew something was wrong and knew exactly what would happen to them if they said so. Chapter 7. The Empire That Lost Money. Enron didn't just trade. Enron built things. Enormous, expensive, physical things all over the world, and a staggering number of them lost money. The person most associated with this side of the company was Rebecca Mark, and she deserves better than the caricature she usually gets. Mark ran Enron International, and in the 1990s she was one of the most prominent women in global business. Genuinely formidable, closing infrastructure deals in countries where American executives typically didn't get past the lobby. She and Skilling despised each other, and their feud is the ideological spine of Enron's middle years. Skilling thought physical assets were a trap. They consume capital, they're illiquid, and they drag down return on equity. He wanted an asset-light company, pure trading, no dirt under the fingernails. Mark thought that was a fantasy, that real businesses own real things, and that the developing world was about to build out its power grid and Enron should own a piece of it. The centerpiece of her strategy, and the most expensive mistake in Enron's history that wasn't an accounting entry, was a power plant at Dabhol, in the Indian state of Maharashtra. Around $3 billion, with a contract from the State Electricity Board guaranteeing payment. On paper, exactly the kind of long-dated guaranteed revenue asset that mark-to-market accounting adores. There was one problem, and it's the sort a room full of brilliant 29-year-old MBAs from Houston can miss entirely. The plant's larger phase was designed to run on liquefied natural gas, shipped in from Qatar, priced in dollars. The electricity would be sold in rupees, to an Indian state board, to Indian households, at around 7 US cents a kilowatt hour, well above what Indian power from conventional sources cost, which meant the state board would be buying expensive electricity and selling it cheap, absorbing a loss on every kilowatt hour for the length of the contract. You do not need a doctorate in economics to see how that ends. In May 2001, the board canceled the agreement and stopped paying. The plant shut down. The second phase, about 95% built, was simply abandoned. Enron had already booked profits on it. Then there was water. In 1998, Enron decided to do to the global water industry what it had done to natural gas, and create a trading market for it. The vehicle was called Azurex, run by Rebecca Mark, and it went public in 1999 to real enthusiasm. Weeks before that listing, Azurex paid $438 million for a 30-year concession to run water services across 2 regions of the province of Buenos Aires. The systems turned out to be in far worse shape than expected. Incomplete customer records, uncollectible receivables, tariff disputes, and the part that made the newspapers, serious water quality problems, with residents complaining of foul odor and discoloration coming out of the taps. The stock had gone out at $19. 18 months later, Enron took the company private, buying back the public shares at around $8. Rebecca Mark resigned in 2000. Notably, she sold her Enron stock on the way out and walked away with a fortune, a fact that irritated a great many people who stayed. This wasn't 2 isolated failures. The same story ran through the whole international portfolio with different scenery each time. A power project in the Philippines, a utility in Brazil hit by currency devaluation, a pulp and paper venture. Add it up and you get the paradox at the center of Enron. The company was reporting record profits every single quarter, while its actual operating businesses were, in aggregate, destroying value. That isn't a rhetorical flourish. It's what the later restatements, the bankruptcy examiner's reports, and the eventual write-downs all point toward. Both of those things were true at the same time, for years, and they could only be true at the same time if somebody was doing something extraordinary with the losses. Which brings us to the Chief Financial Officer. Chapter 8. The Man Who Built the Hole. Andrew Fastow was 36 when he became Chief Financial Officer of Enron in 1998. He was not a trader. He was not an energy person. His background was structured finance at a bank in Chicago, the art of assembling financial vehicles out of legal entities the way an engineer assembles a bridge out of steel. Skilling had recruited him for exactly that skill. In 1999, CFO Magazine gave him an award for excellence in capital structure management. He won an industry award for the precise activity that would later send him to federal prison. Fastow's job, as the pressures around him actually defined it, was to solve an impossible equation every quarter, forever. Enron had to report ever-growing earnings, because the business model and the stock price demanded acceleration. Enron also had to keep its debt low and its balance sheet clean, because it needed an investment-grade credit rating, not vanity. A trading company lives or dies on its rating. Enron's whole business involved counterparties agreeing to 20-year contracts, and nobody signs a 20-year contract with a company that might not survive 5. And all the while Enron kept buying enormous, underperforming assets that generated debt and losses. Those 3 things are mutually exclusive. You cannot buy billions of dollars of money-losing assets, report growing profits, and keep a clean balance sheet. The arithmetic forbids it, unless the losses and the debt go somewhere that isn't your balance sheet. So Fastow built somewhere else, The instrument is called a special purpose entity, an SPE. Then fairness. SPEs are legal, ordinary, and used by thousands of legitimate companies for sensible reasons. If an airline wants to finance a fleet of planes, it can create a separate entity that owns the planes and carries the debt, so the airline's own balance sheet isn't distorted. Normal tool. The tool has a rule attached, and this rule is the single most important number in the Enron story. For an SPE's finances to stay off the parent company's books, an independent outside investor had to hold at least 3% of the entity's equity, and that investment had to be genuinely at risk. 3%, which meant Enron could put 97% of the money into an entity, control what it did in every practical sense, sell it assets, and still legally report its debt as somebody else's problem, as long as 3 cents on the dollar came from a genuine outsider. A hilariously thin membrane. And the entire American financial reporting system was resting on it. So, the maneuver. Enron owns an asset that's underwater, a power plant in a country where the contract has fallen apart, worth far less than Enron paid. Under normal accounting, Enron writes it down and reports the loss. Earnings miss. Stock falls. Instead, Enron creates an SPE. The SPE buys the failing asset at the price Enron wants, not the price a real market would pay, because there is no real market bidding for a stranded power plant, and the buyer is a shell Enron effectively controls. Enron records a sale. The loss vanishes. Sometimes Enron records a gain, because the shell paid generously. Where did the shell get the money? It borrowed. From banks. And why would a bank lend hundreds of millions to a shell whose only asset is a power plant nobody wants? Because Enron quietly guaranteed the loan. That's the trick entire. Enron never sold anything. Enron never got rid of the risk. Enron moved the paperwork into a room shareholders weren't allowed to look inside, and kept the obligation as a promise printed in footnote text almost nobody read. At its peak, Enron had hundreds of these entities, and by some counts thousands once you include every subsidiary and layer. They had names a screenwriter would have been embarrassed to invent. Chuco, after a character from a well-known science fiction franchise. Jedi, a joint venture with a California pension fund. Later, the Raptors. Chuco is the one that matters legally, and the reason is almost comically small. Chuco was set up in late 1997 to buy out the pension fund's stake in Jedi, a stake worth $383 million. 3% of that had to come from genuinely independent outside equity, $11.5 million. Almost none of the money was independent. $240 million came from Barclays, as a loan guaranteed by Enron. $132 million was advanced by Jedi itself, the very partnership being bought. A mid-level Enron employee named Michael Copper, who reported to Fastow, put in $125,000 of his own, and the remaining $11.4 million, the independent equity, the piece the whole structure rested on, was also Barclays. Structured as a loan on Barclays' books and as equity on Chuco's. Barclays wasn't comfortable, so it required $6.6 million set aside in cash reserves, pledged against that equity loan, funded out of Jedi, which means over half the supposedly at-risk outside equity was collateralized with cash, which means it was not at risk, which means the 3% test was never met. Not in 1997, not ever. Jedi and Chuco should have sat on Enron's balance sheet from the beginning, keeping them off inflated Enron's reported profits by around $396 million over 3 years. One more thing about Chuco removes any argument that this was carelessness rather than design. Fastow originally proposed to manage it himself. Enron's own outside law firm advised that he couldn't do it quietly, because as a senior officer his involvement would have to be disclosed to shareholders in the proxy statement. So Copper was installed instead. He reported to Fastow. He was not a senior officer, and therefore nothing had to be disclosed. For his $125,000, Copper and a person close to him took out around $12 million. If it had stopped there, it would already be a scandal. It didn't stop there, because Andy Fastow then did something that, on first hearing, you assume you've misunderstood. He asked the board of directors for permission to run the entities himself, personally, For his own profit. They said yes. Chapter 9. Legame and the Raptors. In June 1999, Andrew Fastow went to Enron's board with a proposal. He wanted to create and personally manage a private investment partnership that would transact with Enron. He would be the general partner. He would raise outside money. He would take a management fee and a share of the profits. And on the other side of every deal would sit Enron, the company where he was chief financial officer. He named it LJM, after the first initials of his wife and 2 sons. The phrase, conflict of interest, is too polite for what he was asking. Fastow wanted to sit on both sides of a negotiating table at once. As CFO, his legal duty was to get the best possible price for Enron's shareholders. As general partner of LJM, his financial interest was to get the best possible price for LJM, which is by definition the worst possible price for Enron. Enron had a written code of ethics prohibiting exactly this, so the board did the only thing that could make it possible. It voted to waive the code of conduct. Not once, multiple times, for multiple partnerships, over 2 years. Enron's directors, a group including a former Stanford Business School dean, a former Commodity Futures Trading Commission chairman, and a British peer, sat in a room and formally suspended their own company's ethics rules so their chief financial officer could do private business with the company he served. The defense offered later was that the board attached safeguards. Skilling was supposed to review the deals. The audit committee was supposed to monitor them. In practice, the review process was barely used, and the monitoring was, by the board's own later admission, superficial. A Senate investigation would conclude that the directors knew enough to have stopped this, and did not. The LJM raised around $15 million. Its successor, LJM2, went out looking for $200 million and came back with commitments reported at close to $400, from a who's who of respectable institutions. Major banks invested. Merrill Lynch marketed it to clients. Pension funds bought in. Why would sophisticated investors put money into a fund whose entire strategy was buying assets from one specific company? Because the pitch was, effectively, that the general partner of this fund is the CFO of the counterparty, and he will make sure the fund does well. That wasn't a bug being hidden. That was the sales feature. Investors were being told, in language just polite enough to be deniable, that the person negotiating against them was on their side. It worked exactly as advertised. Fastow personally took in tens of millions from managing entities whose function was to obscure Enron's true condition from Enron's own shareholders. The exact number was contested, with figures from 30 million to 45 million and beyond, depending on which document you read. The order of magnitude never was. The man paid a salary to protect investors was being paid, separately and enormously, to deceive them. Then came the Raptors. And this is where the scheme stops being merely dishonest and becomes structurally insane. By 2000, Enron had a new problem. It had made large investments in technology and telecom stocks and booked huge mark-to-market gains as their share prices soared during the dot-com bubble. Then the bubble popped. Under mark-to-market, gains run both directions. If you book the run-up as profit, you must book the collapse as loss. Enron was facing losses in the billions. The normal solution is to hedge. Buy protection from an outside party who absorbs your losses in exchange for a fee. That's what insurance is. The essential feature is that the counterparty must be genuinely separate from you and genuinely capable of paying. Enron could not find a real counterparty willing to insure a portfolio that toxic at a price it would accept. So it created 4 entities, the Raptors, through LJM2, and hedged with itself. And what did Enron capitalize these entities with? What was the collateral standing behind a promise to absorb billions of dollars in losses? Enron stock. Enron protected itself against losses using entities whose only meaningful asset was Enron's own shares, which meant the insurance worked perfectly, as long as Enron's stock price stayed high. And Enron's stock price stayed high in large part because Enron kept reporting profits. It could only report because the Raptors were absorbing its losses. A snake eating its own tail, drawn on a whiteboard, presented to a board of directors, approved and audited. Because the moment Enron's stock began to fall, the Raptors' ability to cover losses would fall at exactly the same rate, precisely when the losses were largest. The hedge was engineered to fail at the only moment it would ever be needed. By mid-2001, the Raptors were carrying enormous unrealized losses. Enron restructured them, cross-collateralized them, propped them up with additional stock, buying months at a time. And in the last quarter of 2001, when Enron finally had to unwind the structure, the cost blew a $1.2 billion hole directly in the company's shareholder equity. Not a loss they could smooth, not a charge they could explain. Over $1 billion of shareholder value that had never actually existed, deleted from the balance sheet in a single announcement. That was the moment the market stopped believing anything Enron said. But that's still a year away. In the meantime, Enron had discovered something even more profitable than hiding losses. It had discovered that with mark-to-market accounting, you could report profit on a business that had not been invented yet. Chapter 10. The Business That Never Existed. In January 2000, Enron held its annual analyst conference in Houston, and Jeff Skilling made an announcement that sent the stock up by roughly a quarter of its value within days. Enron was entering broadband. The pitch was pure Skilling, and on its own terms it was brilliant. Enron had taken natural gas, an inert physical commodity, and turned it into a tradable financial market. Why stop there? Bandwidth was also a commodity, also traded inefficiently in long, clumsy fixed contracts. So Enron would build a bandwidth trading market, where companies bought and sold network capacity by the hour the way they bought electricity, with Enron in the middle taking the spread. And to prove the concept, Enron announced a 20-year deal with Blockbuster Video to deliver movies on demand, streamed directly into people's homes over Enron's network. Give them their due on the vision, because Enron was not wrong about the future. In the year 2000, they were describing streaming video on demand, Netflix as we now know it, roughly 7 years before it existed at scale. The idea was correct. The execution was a fantasy. The trial launched in 4 cities with roughly 1,000 subscribers, most of them non-paying volunteers. The technology was not ready. Video quality was poor, delivery was unreliable, and American home broadband in 2000 simply could not carry it. Blockbuster's own spokeswoman later described it as nothing but a pilot project, so small the company never put it on its books. By March 2001, the deal was called off. Actual revenue from actual paying customers was somewhere between scant and non-existent. Then Enron booked a profit on it, on the Blockbuster deal, the one that delivered nothing. Using mark-to-market, Enron estimated the value of 20 years of streaming revenue from a service that had not been built, running over infrastructure that did not exist, to customers who had not signed up, in a market that had not been created. Then recorded a substantial share of that estimate as current earnings. The vehicle was codenamed Project Braveheart. Enron built a joint venture with a small video technology company and an investment fund it controlled itself, then sold a slice of that venture, along with its supposed future revenue stream, to the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, which put in around $115 million in exchange for nearly all the earnings for the first decade. On the strength of that, Enron booked $53 million of revenue in the fourth quarter of 2000 and $58 million in the first quarter of 2001. $111 million, and according to the Justice Department, the vast majority of everything Enron Broadband reported in those 2 quarters. 2 of the executives who structured it were later indicted for it, and this is where Enron's story stops being about accounting and becomes a story about belief. There is a version of these events where Enron's executives are simply lying, and for parts of the story, courts have found exactly that. But the Broadband episode supports a messier reading, and it explains more. Set against what Skilling actually said, publicly and privately, about streaming and bandwidth, it becomes difficult to argue he didn't believe it. He appears to have been sincerely convinced that streaming video was inevitable, that bandwidth trading was inevitable, and that Enron would dominate both. We can't see inside his head. What we can observe is that he kept predicting a future that largely arrived, just years too late to save him. That's the trap. Mark-to-market accounting handed an organization full of people who believed they were the smartest in the room the power to convert their own confidence directly into reported earnings. And Rank and Yank fired anyone who suggested the confidence might be misplaced. Enron built a perfect machine for converting belief into money. The machine did not care whether the belief was correct. Chapter 11. The people who were supposed to catch it, which leaves the question everybody asks about this story, and it's the right question. Where was everybody else? America has an entire architecture built specifically to prevent this. Auditors, boards, rating agencies, equity analysts, regulators, financial journalists. Enron was one of the most closely followed companies in the world. So how did every layer fail at once? The answer isn't that they were stupid. The answer is that almost every one of them was being paid by Enron. Start with the analysts. The people who told the public whether to buy Enron stock worked at investment banks, and those banks earned enormous fees from Enron, underwriting its debt and structuring its financings. An analyst who issued a sell rating risked costing his own firm tens of millions in banking business, and Enron made the consequences unmistakable. When one analyst at a major firm criticized the company, it was widely reported that Enron complained directly to his employer and that his career suffered for it. The message circulated. By 2001, with the company months from bankruptcy, the overwhelming majority of Wall Street analysts covering Enron still rated it a buy. Some maintained buy ratings while the stock was in free fall, right up to the bankruptcy filing. The banks themselves weren't passive. Major institutions helped design and finance the very structures that hid Enron's debt. Some lent money to the off-balance sheet entities. Some engineered transactions that functioned as loans but got recorded by Enron as cash flow from operations, which flattered the exact metric investors watch most closely. Several of the world's largest banks later paid settlements running into the billions over their roles. Not because they were fooled, because they helped. The credit rating agencies kept Enron at investment grade until days before the bankruptcy. They were paid by Enron. They were shown the same footnotes as everyone else. They asked, by their own later testimony to Congress, remarkably few hard questions. The board flew in twice a year, sat through presentations, and approved. A Senate subcommittee later concluded that the directors had received enough information to identify serious problems and did not act. Several had financial relationships with Enron beyond their board fees. And Enron was one of the most politically connected corporations in America, with donations flowing to both parties for over a decade. It lobbied intensively on energy deregulation and successfully against tighter regulation of the derivatives markets it dominated. The specific conflict that let Arthur Andersen earn more from consulting than from auditing was itself the subject of a serious SEC reform proposal in the late 1990s. The accounting industry mobilized against it, and it was beaten back. There is one exception, and leaving it out would be dishonest. A handful of professional skeptics did see it, most prominently the short seller Jim Chanos, who started digging into Enron's filings in late 2000 and concluded the returns didn't justify the price. What those people had in common is that none of them was paid by Enron. They made money if Enron fell. The only participants with a clean incentive to look hard were the ones the company had no way to buy, which points to a conclusion that's uncomfortable but hard to argue around. Enron did not slip through the cracks in the American financial oversight system. On the record of who was paying whom, Enron had effectively bought it. Nearly every gatekeeper was a client, a beneficiary, a partner, or a recipient. The watchdogs were on the payroll. And when the system finally did produce a warning, it came from a 31-year-old reporter who had been on the finance beat for a couple of years and asked a question so simple it was almost rude. We'll get to her. First, California. Chapter 12. California. In 1996, California deregulated its electricity market. The intention was sensible. The design was a disaster, and the specific way it broke is what made everything after it possible. Under the new system, the state's big utilities were forced to sell off many of their own power plants. They were no longer supposed to generate electricity. They were supposed to buy it. They were also largely forbidden from signing long-term contracts, which pushed them onto the short-term spot market, where competition would supposedly keep prices honest, and the price they could charge consumers was frozen, which left those utilities legally required to buy at any price and legally forbidden from charging more. If you're a trader and you understand that structure, you are looking at the most exploitable market ever constructed in the developed world. The buyer cannot refuse and cannot walk away. Electricity cannot be meaningfully stored. Demand does not fall when prices rise, because people do not stop using refrigerators. Enron understood it immediately. What followed, between roughly the summer of 2000 and the summer of 2001, was a systematic campaign to manufacture scarcity in a market where scarcity meant unlimited pricing power. The strategies had internal nicknames, later documented in memos written by Enron's own lawyers. Death Star. Enron would schedule electricity to flow along transmission paths in a way that appeared, on paper, to relieve grid congestion. California's grid operator paid a fee for relieving congestion, and Enron collected it. In some versions, the power went in a circle and ended up right back where it started. Enron got paid for solving a problem it had helped create, by moving electricity that didn't need to move. Ricochet, sometimes called megawatt laundering. California capped the price of power generated and sold inside the state. So Enron bought California power cheaply, exported it across the state line, and immediately sold it back in, whereas an out-of-state import, it was no longer subject to the cap. Same electrons, sometimes barely leaving the state, several times the price. There were others. Get Shorty, selling reserve capacity Enron didn't possess and covering the position later. Fat Boy, inflating demand schedules well beyond what customers needed and selling the surplus into the emergency market at premium prices. And then there were the power plants. That call at the top of this video, where a trader asks an operator to get creative and find a reason to go down, is one of many. The operator asks whether they should describe it as maintenance or as a forced outage. The trader confirms it doesn't matter which. The recordings exist for a mundane reason. Energy traders tape their phone calls, because a verbal agreement to sell power is a contract, and somebody has to be able to prove what was said. So Enron recorded everything. The tapes then sat in government hands for years, until a small public utility district in Washington state got hold of them and released them to CBS News in 2004. The strangest thing about them isn't the content. It's the register. No lowered voice, no coded language, no pause before the incriminating part. What we can reasonably read into that isn't that these men were unusually cruel, but that it never occurred to them anyone would be listening. Physically, not financially, what the shutdown calls mean is this. A functioning power plant, capable of producing electricity, was deliberately switched off during a heat wave in a state where people were about to lose power to make the remaining electricity more expensive. It worked. Through late 2000 and 2001, California ran rolling blackouts. Hospitals on generators, traffic signals dark in major cities, businesses closed, schools sent children home, and Silicon Valley, in the middle of the tech boom, lost power. Electricity that had run around $30 to $35 a megawatt hour traded in the hundreds, and at the peaks above 1,000. The California Attorney General's own review put the arithmetic like this. In 1999, the first full year of deregulation, the state paid $7.4 billion for wholesale electricity. In 2000, it paid $27.1 billion, a rise of 277%, and costs stayed there through 2001. In the single month of June 2000, California's power bill exceeded $3.6 billion, about half of what the entire previous year had cost. And the shortage was, in the physical sense, not real. California had around 45 gigawatts of installed generating capacity. At the moment the blackouts hit, demand was 28. The state's three big utilities lost between $12 and $14 billion. In April 2001, Pacific Gas and Electric was forced into bankruptcy because it was legally required to keep buying power at prices it was legally forbidden to charge for. The state of California stepped in and began buying power directly, signing long-term contracts at panic prices that ratepayers would be paying off for years. Governor Gray Davis was recalled from office in 2003, and the energy crisis was the single largest factor. And in Houston, on the trading floor, they knew exactly what was happening. That's the part that resists any charitable interpretation. On the tapes, traders joke about the money being taken from, their phrase, poor grandmothers in California. They describe it, laughing, as stealing. On one call, a trader describes an accident caused by a blackout that had knocked out a traffic signal, and the response from the other end of the line is that this is beautiful too. One trader can be heard wondering aloud, with a laugh, what happens if this all comes out, whether people will come back and take the money off them. They did try. The Snohomish County utility that obtained these tapes went through them alongside the trading records and concluded Enron's manipulation had cost Western customers at least $1.1 billion. Enron's head of West Coast Trading, Tim Belden, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Enron was not solely responsible for the California energy crisis, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something simpler than the truth. California hadn't built significant new capacity in years. Demand was rising. A drought had cut hydroelectric supply from the Pacific Northwest. Gas prices spiked nationally. And other generators and traders gamed the market too, several of whom later paid settlements. But Enron was the most aggressive, the most creative, and by far the most thoroughly documented, because Enron wrote its strategies down in memos drafted by its own lawyers and recorded its own phone calls. None of this, incidentally, was part of the criminal case against Lay and Skilling. The trial judge excluded the trader tapes on the grounds that the two men were not charged with market manipulation in California. The most damning audio in American corporate history was never played to the jury that decided their fate. The darkest irony sits underneath all of it. At the exact moment Enron was making enormous profits from California, its trading business posting the best numbers in company history, the company itself was already terminally sick. The California money was, in a sense, the last thing keeping it alive. Enron manufactured a crisis for an entire state to buy itself a few more quarters. It wasn't enough, because in March 2001, while the blackouts were still rolling, a magazine article appeared that ran barely more than a page and asked one question. Chapter 13. The question nobody could answer. Bethany McLean was 31, a Williams College math major, who'd spent 3 years at Goldman Sachs before moving into journalism. She was a reporter at Fortune, the magazine that had spent the previous 6 years putting Enron on its most innovative list. In early 2001, a source suggested she look at Enron's financial statements, specifically, read the cash flow statement, so she did. What she found was not a smoking gun. It was something stranger. She could not figure out how the company made money. The revenues were staggering, around $100 billion for 2000, which would place Enron among the largest corporations on Earth. The earnings were consistently excellent. The stock was priced at a huge multiple, but the cash flow was weak. Reported profits were not converting into money in the bank. The debt was climbing. And the disclosures explaining where the profits came from were, in her reading, close to unintelligible. So she started calling analysts. And this is the detail that should have ended Enron a year earlier than it did. The professional analysts, people whose entire job was covering this company, who had buy ratings on it, who were telling clients to put retirement money into it, could not explain the business either. One told her Enron was a black box. Others acknowledged they took the company's word for it. They liked the stock. They believed in management. They could not describe the mechanism by which the earnings appeared. She called Enron for comment. She spoke to Jeff Skilling, and the conversation went badly almost immediately. He was dismissive. He told her she didn't understand the business, his standard response to hard questions, delivered often enough that it became a company catchphrase. She kept pressing on why the financial statements didn't explain the earnings. He grew frustrated, told her it was unethical of Fortune to be doing this without properly researching it, and hung up on her. Then Enron did something revealing. The next day, Andrew Fastow flew to New York. Along with 2 other senior executives, he went to Fortune's offices and spent hours trying to persuade McLean and her editors that everything was fine. Fastow was, by her account, charming and reassuring. He emphasized how much he cared about Enron's reputation and made a point of saying he didn't concern himself with the stock price. A CFO has to want a story stopped very badly indeed to get on a plane over a 1,500-word article that hasn't even run yet. It ran anyway. March 5, 2001. The headline was a question: is Enron overpriced? By modern standards, it was almost mild. It did not allege fraud. It made one observation: nobody could explain how this company made money, and the stock was priced as though everyone could. The article did not bring Enron down. The stock dipped and recovered. Skilling reportedly dismissed it internally. Life went on. But something had shifted. A question had been asked out loud, in print, by a major publication, and it had not been answered. Once a question like that is in the air, every subsequent piece of bad news gets read differently. The Enron story from here is that one question: how does this company actually make money? Being asked by more and more people, louder and louder, until the company could no longer survive the silence, where the answer should have been. 6 weeks later, it got asked on a live call, in front of every major investor in America. Chapter 14. The Call. Quarterly earnings calls are among the most tightly choreographed events in corporate life. The company reports its numbers, executives read prepared remarks, then analysts ask questions. The questions are usually polite. Everyone on that call has a professional relationship to protect. On April 17, 2001, Enron reported another strong quarter. Skilling ran through the results. Then the call opened for questions. Richard Grubman was not a sell-side analyst. He ran a hedge fund, and his fund was short Enron stock, meaning he profited if the price went down, which gave him something almost nobody else on those calls had: no relationship to protect and no reason to be deferential. His question was procedural and, on the surface, dull. He asked what Enron's assets and liabilities from price risk management had been at the end of the quarter. In plain English, what the trading book actually looked like. Skilling replied that the balance sheet wasn't finished and would come with the quarterly filing. Grubman pressed. He had just heard Skilling say Enron reconciled its trading positions and credit exposure every single day. So why couldn't the company produce those figures now? And he added the line that ended up in every account of the call: that Enron was the only financial institution he knew of that couldn't produce a balance sheet or a cash flow statement alongside its earnings. That sounds technical. It isn't. For a company whose entire business is trading, where the central question is how much are you holding and how much do you owe, an income statement without a balance sheet is a photograph of the scoreboard with the field cropped out. Grubman had raised it on previous calls. He would later say it had been 6 straight quarters. And Jeff Skilling, chief executive of the 7th largest company in America, on a recorded line, with hundreds of investors and journalists listening, lost his composure completely. He stumbled over his words. He thanked Grubman, thinly, and then he called him a crude, unmistakable insult, live on the call. Inside Enron's building, people reportedly cheered. The CEO had finally hit back at a short seller who'd been talking down the stock for months. Outside it, the reaction was rather different. It made headlines within hours. The moment is famous because it's shocking. But the reason it matters isn't the profanity. What the profanity revealed. Skilling had spent his entire career as the most composed, most analytically fluent executive in the industry, a man whose whole authority rested on always having a better answer than the person asking. And when someone asked, calmly and in public, to see the balance sheet, he didn't have a better answer. He had an insult. Skilling's own explanation, given to Reuters within hours, is revealing in a different way. He said he'd known the microphone was live, and that he didn't think it was fair to shareholders to hand a platform to a short seller talking his own book. That is a coherent position. It is also, notably, not an answer to the question. Grubman's substantive point came out afterwards, in his own comments to reporters, and got buried under the profanity. His argument went further than the missing balance sheet. It was that Skilling and his management team had sold something like 7 million shares over the previous year, $500 million worth, at prices in the 70s and 80s, while declining to show shareholders the statement that would reveal what the company actually held and owed. Enron's stock closed at $60 that day. It had peaked above $90 the previous summer. 4 months after this call, Jeff Skilling would resign. 7 months after this call, Enron would be bankrupt. Chapter 15. The Resignation. On August 14, 2001, Jeff Skilling resigned as Chief Executive Officer of Enron. He had held the job for 6 months. He'd wanted it for a decade. He had built the business model, built the culture, built the trading operation, outmaneuvered every internal rival, and finally taken the top job in February 2001, when Ken Lay stepped back to become chairman. In August, he walked away, saying he was leaving for personal reasons and to spend more time with his family. He said the stock price decline had nothing to do with it. He said there was nothing wrong at the company. Nobody believed it. Enron's stock fell on the announcement, and analysts, journalists, and employees all reached the same conclusion within about a day. The man who understood this company better than anyone alive had just walked out the door at the exact moment it started to shake. Skilling has maintained ever since, through investigations, a trial, and 12 years in federal prison, that he left because he was exhausted and unhappy, and that he had no knowledge of any fraud. You can decide what you believe. The verifiable part is this. In the weeks and months around his departure, Skilling sold large amounts of Enron stock. One specific sale, placed in September 2001, became one of the counts a jury convicted him on for insider trading. Ken Lay returned as chief executive and began the most important communications campaign of his life. On the 26th of September 2001, with the shares at $27, he told employees the stock was an incredible bargain, that the third quarter was looking great, and that the company would hit its numbers. 3 weeks later, Enron announced the charge that began the collapse. In an online forum with employees, he was reassuring, encouraging people to talk up the company, tell their friends, buy. Enron employees listened. Many bought more. Some borrowed to do it. Some moved additional retirement savings into Enron stock that autumn because the chairman told them it was cheap. At the same time, Lay was selling. Over the course of 2001, he sold something on the order of $70 million of Enron stock back to the company itself, much of it to repay a line of credit Enron had extended to him. Because of a disclosure rule, sales made to repay a company loan got reported far less promptly than ordinary open market sales. The public would not learn the scale of it until well after the collapse. He was telling employees to buy while he was selling. His defense, argued at trial with genuine force, was that he believed every word he said. That he thought the company was fundamentally sound. That he was selling only because banks were issuing margin calls on loans secured by Enron stock and he had no choice. That he lost an enormous personal fortune in the collapse, which is true. The jury did not accept it. But before any of that, one day after Skilling's resignation, a vice president in Enron's finance division sat down and wrote a letter to Ken Lay. She would later be told that raising these issues could cost her her job. She was right about that. She was also right about everything else. Chapter 16. The Memo. Sharon Watkins was a vice president at Enron and a certified public accountant. Before joining in 1993, she had worked at Arthur Andersen, which meant she understood, at a technical level, precisely what she was looking at. In mid-2001, she was moved into a role reporting to Andrew Fastow, and her assignment was to look through Enron's assets for things that could be sold off. That's how she found the Raptors. By her own account to Congress, what stopped her was a single number. One of the Raptor entities had lost around $700 million. And she could not find anyone who could explain how that loss had disappeared from Enron's reported results. She started pulling on the structures, and reached the conclusion a trained accountant reaches once the picture assembles. The entities Enron used to hedge its losses were collateralized with Enron's own stock, which meant Enron was hedging with itself, which meant it wasn't a hedge at all, which meant hundreds of millions of dollars of losses Enron had reported as neutralized were sitting in a structure with nothing real behind it. On August 15, 2001, One day after Skilling resigned, she wrote an anonymous memo to Ken Lay. Its most quoted line, prophetic in a way she probably didn't intend, was her fear that Enron would implode in a wave of accounting scandals. She laid out the specific structures. She noted that Skilling's abrupt departure would make investors look harder at exactly these questions. And she made an argument that in hindsight is the tragedy of the whole thing, that Enron should get ahead of this, restate the numbers, take the pain, and survive as a smaller and honest company, because if it came out on someone else's timetable, there would be no company left at all. She was offering Ken Lay a way out, in August, 3.5 months before bankruptcy. Lay agreed to meet her. She revealed herself as the author and sat down with him. She told him plainly that the accounting could not possibly be as creative as it appeared to be, and that this was going to come apart. Lay listened. He thanked her. He said he'd look into it. Then Enron did two things. First, it asked its longtime outside law firm, Vinson and Elkins, to investigate. This was the same firm that had provided legal work on some of the very transactions in question. Watkins had specifically warned in her memo against using the company's usual advisors to review the company's usual advisors' work. They were used anyway. The review was limited in scope. It did not include a detailed re-examination of the accounting. It interviewed a relatively small number of people, several of whom were the architects of the structures being questioned. Its conclusion, delivered in October, was that the transactions were bad-looking but not improper, and that no further investigation was warranted. Second, Enron's in-house lawyers looked into whether they could fire her. Notes and testimony from the period indicate counsel researched the legal consequences of terminating an employee who had raised accounting concerns, including whether Texas law would protect her. They did not fire her. Not because they decided it was wrong, because the company collapsed before they got round to it. When the memo became public during congressional investigations, Watkins became famous as the Enron whistleblower, a label she has always pushed back on, and correctly. She did not go to regulators. She did not go to the press. She went to her chief executive, internally, which is exactly what corporate ethics training tells employees to do. She followed the rules. The rules did not work. The real lesson of the memo isn't the comfortable one. The Enron story often gets told as though the problem was that nobody spoke up. Someone did speak up, in writing, to the chief executive, with specifics, with names, with structures identified, 3.5 months before the bankruptcy, and the machinery of the company processed her warning, hired its own friends to review it, cleared itself, and considered whether to remove her. The system didn't fail to hear her. It heard her perfectly and rejected her. Chapter 17. The Quietest Exit. Of everyone in this story, the man who came out best is the one almost nobody has heard of. Lou Pai ran Enron Energy Services, the division meant to sell energy directly to businesses and households in the newly deregulated retail market. He was intensely private, rarely spoke to the press, and even inside Enron he was known as remote and hard to read. Colleagues called him the invisible CEO. The division was not a success. It signed enormous long-term contracts with corporations and universities, promising to manage their energy costs. And because those were long-dated contracts, Enron booked the projected profits up front, under mark-to-market. The division reported strong earnings. Investigators later concluded the underlying business was losing very large sums, with losses obscured by moving them into the trading operation. Then, in the late spring of 2001, Lou Pai sold almost all of his Enron stock. He didn't sell gradually. Between the 18th of May and the 7th of June, a window of 3 weeks, he sold roughly 339,000 shares outright and exercised options that put another 573,000 onto the open market. Estimates of what he took out of Enron across his whole 10-year cluster between $250 and $300 million. He left the company in June 2001, 6 months before the bankruptcy, 2 months before Skilling quit, 4 months before the first restatement, the single best-timed exit in the entire collapse. The detail that makes this the strangest footnote in the story comes with a complication that usually gets left out of it. The reason he needed to liquidate is not disputed. A personal scandal had led to an expensive divorce settlement, and he needed cash. That version is true. The man who escaped Enron with more money than anyone else needed the money for a personal legal bill. But it isn't the whole picture, and the difference matters legally. 7 years later, the SEC alleged that before he sold, Pai had learned from the new management of his old division that it had identified serious operational problems and large contract losses. Losses that, had they been reported, would have turned a $40 million quarterly profit into a loss of at least $60 million. So the fairest reading is probably this. The divorce created the need to sell. The question of what he knew when he sold is a separate one, and the SEC's answer was not favorable to him. He settled that case without admitting or denying anything, for $31.5 million and a 5-year bar from serving as an officer or director of a public company. He admitted nothing. He served no time. 2 years before any of this, in 1999, he had bought a ranch in southern Colorado, 77,500 acres, for around $23 million, which made him the second largest private landowner in the state. Locals took to calling the 14,000-foot peak on it Mount Pai. He sold it in 2004 for about $60 million. He gave no interviews. He appeared in no documentaries. He resurfaced quietly in the energy world and has otherwise spent 2 decades being, successfully, nobody's idea of a story. 20,000 people lost their jobs and their savings. The man who got out with the most was the one who happened to need cash for personal reasons at exactly the right moment. That's not a moral. It's just what happened, and any honest version of this story has to include it, because the neat version, where the guilty are punished in proportion to their guilt, is not the version that occurred. Chapter 18. 49 days. From the first crack to the bankruptcy filing was 49 days. October 16th. Enron reports third quarter results. Buried in them is a loss of $618 million, attributed to charges the company calls non-recurring. On a call with analysts, Ken Lay also mentions, almost in passing, a reduction of $1.2 billion in shareholder equity. He does not dwell on it. But every professional listening understands that a company does not casually delete more than $1 billion of equity, and within 24 hours the questions start. The $1.2 billion was the Raptors, unwinding. The structure that hedged Enron against itself had finally been asked to pay, and it could not. October 22nd. Enron discloses that the SEC has asked it to hand over information about its related party transactions. It's described as an informal inquiry. 9 days later, it becomes a formal investigation. The stock falls sharply and keeps falling. October 24th. Andrew Fastow is removed as Chief Financial Officer. Lay tells employees he has lost confidence in him. 2 days earlier, Lay had publicly expressed confidence in him. The market reads the reversal correctly. The company has just cut loose the man who built its financial structure, which means the structure is indefensible. November 8th. Enron restates its financial statements going back to 1997. This is the moment the lie becomes a legal fact. Previously reported earnings across 4.5 years were overstated by roughly $586 million, because entities including Chuco should have been consolidated onto the balance sheet all along. Nearly half a decade of Enron's reported financial history withdrawn in a single filing. Everything anyone had used to value this company, every analyst model, every rating, every pension fund's decision to buy, was based on numbers the company was now formally retracting. November 9th. A lifeline. Dynegy, a smaller crosstown Houston rival, agrees to acquire Enron in a stock deal valued at around $9 billion, with an immediate $1.5 billion equity infusion funded by Chevron Texaco. It's announced as a merger. Everyone knows it's a rescue. For about 2 weeks, it almost works. November 19th. Enron files its quarterly report, and inside it is a detail that kills the deal. The company must repay around $690 million in debt, imminently, because of a credit trigger. Dynegy's team reads the filing and realizes something that changes everything. They do not actually know how much Enron owes. Nobody does. Due diligence is uncovering more obligations, faster than they can count them. November 28th. The rating agencies downgrade Enron to junk. Everything ends at once. The downgrade triggers immediate repayment demands on billions Enron does not have. Trading counterparties stop dealing with the company within hours because nobody signs a 20-year contract with a junk-rated firm, which is the exact scenario Fastow spent 4 years building an empire of shell companies to prevent. Dynegy terminates the merger the same day. Enron stock falls to around 61 cents. December 2nd. Enron Corporation files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. $63.4 billion in assets on the last balance sheet before the filing. The largest corporate bankruptcy in United States history at the time, a record it would hold for less than a year, until WorldCom, itself partly a consequence of the environment Enron created. A company valued at roughly $70 billion at its peak was worth, in equity terms, nothing. The stock that traded at $90.75 in August 2000 ended at 26 cents. 16 months. That's the whole arc, from the top to zero. And now we have to talk about the people who were not on the trading floor, not on the board, and not in the partnerships. The ones who simply worked there. Chapter 19. What it cost. On the morning of December 3, 2001, Enron employees in Houston were told to gather their belongings and leave. Roughly 4,500 people out of about 7,500 at headquarters lost their jobs that day. They were told they'd receive severance capped at $4,500. Losing the job was the smaller half of it. Like most American companies, Enron offered a 401k. Employees put in a percentage of their salary, and the company matched a portion. Two features made Enron different. Enron did not match in cash. It matched half of what an employee put in, up to 6% of salary, and it paid that match entirely in Enron stock. And employees were not permitted to sell those matched shares until they reached the age of 50. On that portion, the plan made its own staff involuntary Enron shareholders for as long as it took them to turn 50. The part of this that most retellings leave out makes the story simpler than it was. The forced element was only a slice. Enron and the Congressional Research Service both estimated that around 89% of the Enron stock in that plan had been bought by employees voluntarily, with their own contributions, out of 19 or 20 available options. They were free to sell those shares at any time. Most of them didn't. So the plan structure lit the fire. What poured fuel on it was the culture. Enron's stock rose almost continuously for a decade. Executives, including Ken Lay, told employees repeatedly that the stock was a great investment. Employees who put more of their voluntary contributions into it were, for years, rewarded for doing so. At the end of 2000, 62% of the value of Enron's 401k plan was sitting in Enron stock. Then, in the autumn of 2001, as the collapse accelerated, the plan went into a lockdown. The stated reason was administrative. The company was changing plan administrators, and during such a transition, accounts get frozen so records can be transferred. Routine event. The timing has been argued about ever since, and the disagreement is not small. Enron said the freeze ran 12 trading days from late October. Employees testified to notices covering a much longer window. One former employee testified her account was locked as early as late September. What is not in dispute is the effect. During a period in which Enron's stock was in freefall, a great many employees could not sell. Congressional hearings in 2002 produced testimony from people who had spent entire careers at Enron and its predecessor companies. One described following the company's guidance, putting the overwhelming majority of a retirement account into Enron stock, and watching a six-figure nest egg go to nothing inside a matter of weeks. There was testimony from people who had planned to retire within the year and instead had nothing. People in their 60s went back into the workforce. The 401k plan alone lost about $1 billion in value. In the roughly 3 years leading up to the collapse, Enron executives and directors sold company stock worth, by the accounting and the shareholder litigation that followed, more than $1 billion. A figure covering some 29 named insiders. The amount the people at the top took out is, near enough, the amount the people at the bottom lost. And Enron employees were not the only ones exposed. Public pension funds, the retirement systems of teachers and firefighters and police officers across the country, held Enron stock because it was a large-cap company in every major index with investment-grade credit and glowing analyst coverage. The Florida state pension system alone reported losses in the hundreds of millions. The cost of this was never confined to Houston. It got distributed, thinly and invisibly, across millions of Americans who had never heard of a special-purpose entity and had no way to know their retirement was resting on one. And there was one more institution about to be destroyed. Not a victim, exactly, an accomplice. Chapter 20. The Firm That Died With It. Arthur Andersen LLP was founded in 1913 by a 28-year-old accountant, the youngest CPA in Illinois at the time. The story the firm told about itself for 90 years concerned its founder refusing to sign off on a client's books, when the client was large and the firm was small, and the refusal could have ended it. He refused anyway. The principle handed down from that became the firm's identity. Tell the truth, plainly, regardless of consequence. By 2001, Andersen was one of the 5 largest accounting firms in the world. 85,000 employees, offices in 84 countries, a reputation that took most of a century to build. They would be effectively dead within 8 months. The lead partner on the Enron account was David Duncan, early 40s, running the largest and most prestigious client his office had. The relationship generated around $52 million in the year 2000 alone. The Houston office was billing its client roughly $1 million a week, and Duncan carried an annual target of growing sales by 20%. Enron was not simply Duncan's largest client. Enron was Duncan's career. Duncan's team, around 100 people, worked out of the client's building, and employees moved across so regularly that by the end, something like 300 of Enron's senior and middle managers were former Andersen staff. Andersen was auditing the work of Andersen alumni who had learned how to do that work at Andersen. In February 2001, 10 months before the bankruptcy, senior Andersen partners held a meeting to discuss whether to keep Enron as a client. They discussed the aggressive accounting, the related party transactions, the risk. According to the record that later emerged, they characterized their client's use of mark-to-market accounting as intelligent gambling. They decided to keep the client. There is also documentation that Andersen personnel had raised objections to specific Enron structures over the years, and that at least one senior professional in the firm's internal risk group, who pressed hard on the accounting, was removed from oversight of the account after Enron complained. The auditors saw it. They wrote about it. They were overruled, sometimes by their own firm, sometimes by the economics of the relationship. Then came the shredding. On October 12, 2001, 4 days before Enron's disastrous earnings announcement, and while Andersen's internal lawyers already knew an SEC inquiry was a live possibility, an in-house attorney sent a message to the Enron engagement team, reminding them of the firm's document retention policy. Document retention policies are legitimate. Every large firm has one, and the policy in question did, on its face, permit the destruction of certain draft materials. What followed was not routine. Over the following weeks, the Houston office destroyed an extraordinary volume of Enron-related material. Reports at the time described trolley loads of documents fed into shredders, extra shredding capacity brought in, tens of thousands of emails and computer files deleted, and material shipped in from other offices to be destroyed. The shredding continued until November 9th, the day after Enron restated 4 years of earnings, and the day the Houston office received a formal subpoena from the SEC. Andersen fired Duncan in January 2002, saying he had led the destruction. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and cooperated with prosecutors. In March 2002, the Department of Justice indicted Arthur Andersen LLP itself, the entire firm, on a single count of obstruction of justice. That indictment was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. Under the rules of the time, a firm convicted of a felony could not audit publicly traded companies, and clients could not wait for an appeal. They began leaving immediately, in the hundreds. In June 2002, A jury convicted Arthur Andersen. The firm surrendered its licenses. 85,000 jobs, gone or absorbed into rivals. 90 years of institutional history ended. The Big Five became the Big Four, and they remain the Big Four today. Then the coda. In May 2005, the Supreme Court of the United States reviewed the conviction. It overturned it. Unanimously, 9-0. The reasoning was narrow and technical. The instructions given to the jury had been flawed, allowing a conviction without requiring the jury to find that Andersen's people acted with real consciousness of wrongdoing. Merely persuading someone to follow a document retention policy, the court held, is not automatically a crime, even if a lawsuit is foreseeable. The line between routine document management and criminal obstruction has to be drawn by intent, and the jury had never been properly asked about intent. The conviction was vacated. The government decided not to retry the case. Duncan was permitted to withdraw his guilty plea. 3 years too late. Arthur Andersen no longer existed. You cannot unshred a global accounting firm. 85,000 people had already lost their jobs over a conviction the Supreme Court unanimously found to be improperly obtained. Whether Andersen deserved to die for its conduct at Enron is a legitimate argument, and reasonable people take both sides. What is not really arguable is that the firm was destroyed by an indictment rather than by a verdict, and that when the verdict was finally examined by the highest court in the country, it did not survive. Enron killed things that weren't even Enron. Chapter 21, January 2002. Before this next section, a brief note. It involves a death by suicide, and I'm going to handle it the way it deserves. Factually, briefly, and without detail. If that's something you'd rather skip, the next chapter begins in about 90 seconds. J. Clifford Baxter was Enron's former vice chairman. He had been at the company for more than a decade. He was well liked, and he was widely regarded as one of the more decent people in senior management. He was also, importantly, one of the people who had objected internally. Baxter had raised concerns about the partnerships, about how they looked, about what they were being used for, about the reputational risk. Sharon Watkins named him in her memo as someone who had complained to Skilling about the impropriety of the structures. He had, by multiple accounts, argued and been overruled, repeatedly. He resigned from Enron in May 2001, months before the collapse. After the bankruptcy, Baxter was named in shareholder lawsuits. He was subpoenaed by Congress, and he had agreed to appear the following month. Investigators did not regard him as a target. The reporting at the time indicates they expected him to give evidence about others. Given what he had objected to, and when, he was regarded as a potentially significant witness, someone who had been inside the room and had, on the record, disagreed with what was happening in it. On January 25, 2002, he was found dead near his home in a suburb of Houston. His death was ruled a suicide. He was 43 years old. He never testified. That is the whole of what this documentary will say about it. There has been a great deal of speculation over the years, and no evidence has ever supported any of it. The initial finding was criticized at the time for being reached too quickly, so the case was kept open and examined further, and an independent forensic review commissioned by his family reached the same conclusion. Where the record is clear, we should say so clearly. The reason it belongs in this story is not mystery. It's that Enron's damage was never confined to a balance sheet. It reached the people who worked there, the people who invested in it, the people who audited it, and the people who tried, from the inside, to stop it and could not. Even the executives who raised their hands could not get clear of the wreckage. Chapter 22. The Reckoning. In the first months of 2002, Enron became the biggest story in America. There were congressional hearings across multiple committees, broadcast live, producing some of the most watched corporate testimony in American history, partly because of the image of one witness after another declining to answer. Kenneth Lay invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So did Andrew Fastow and Michael Copper and others. Skilling did testify and told Congress under oath that he was not aware of any financial improprieties and that the company was in good shape when he left. Sharon Watkins testified at length, and her account of writing the memo, meeting Lay, and watching the company hire its own law firm to investigate itself became the spine of the public understanding of the case. Investigators concluded that the board had failed in its fiduciary duty, and so had the auditors, the analysts, and the rating agencies. A Senate subcommittee found that Enron's directors had been informed of the high-risk accounting, the off-books activity, and the conflicts of interest, and had allowed all of it to proceed. Out of that came the most consequential piece of American corporate legislation in 70 years, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, signed in July 2002, a response to Enron and to the wave that followed it, above all WorldCom, which collapsed that summer in an accounting fraud even larger in dollar terms. 4 things changed. Chief executives and chief financial officers must now personally sign a statement certifying that their company's financial statements are accurate, and knowingly signing a false one is a federal crime with prison attached. That is the direct answer to the Enron defense of "I didn't know what my finance department was doing." That defense now has a signature on it. Accounting firms are barred from selling a long list of consulting services to the companies they audit. Lead partners must rotate off clients, and there are cooling-off periods before an auditor can take a senior finance job at a client. The Arthur Andersen arrangement is now largely illegal. The Public Company Accounting Oversight Board was created. Before Enron, the accounting profession largely policed itself. It does not anymore, and employees who report suspected securities fraud got federal protection from retaliation. The direct response to a company that researched whether it could fire the person who warned it. Sarbanes-Oxley is not universally loved. Critics argue it imposed heavy costs on smaller public companies and pushed firms to stay private longer. Those criticisms have real force. But the specific mechanics that let Enron happen were all closed. Not perfectly closed. Then there was the criminal case. The Justice Department's Enron task force charged more than 30 people and secured convictions or guilty pleas from around 20 of them, though several were later overturned or narrowed on appeal. The first domino was Michael Copper, who had run Chuco. In August 2002, he pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. Copper gave prosecutors Fastow. In January 2004, Andrew Fastow pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy and surrendered tens of millions in assets. And there was one more term, the human hinge of the whole prosecution. Fastow's wife Leah had also worked at Enron as an assistant treasurer and was charged over the tax treatment of money flowing from the partnerships. She pleaded guilty and served roughly a year. The couple had 2 young children, and the agreements were structured so the sentences would not overlap. One parent at home while the other was incarcerated. One more domino fell right before trial. In late December 2005, Richard Causey, Enron's former chief accounting officer, who was supposed to sit at the defense table alongside Lay and Skilling, pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. 5 weeks before opening statements, the 2 men lost the third chair. Andrew Fastow, the architect, the man who built the hole and profited from it personally, became the government's most important cooperating witness. Chapter 23. The Trial. The trial of Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling began on January 30, 2006, in Houston. The city Enron had dominated, in front of a jury, drawn from the population most directly damaged by the collapse. It ran roughly 4 months, with Judge Sim Lake presiding. The government's theory was straightforward. This was not a case about whether mark-to-market accounting was permissible, or whether special-purpose entities were legal. Both could be. The case was about lying, that Lay and Skilling had knowingly made false statements to investors, employees, and auditors about the company's true condition, while personally profiting from the stock those statements supported. The defense theory was equally clear, and it was not absurd. Skilling's position was that Enron was a fundamentally sound and genuinely innovative company destroyed by a run, a crisis of confidence triggered by short sellers, hostile press, and market panic, not by fraud. He argued that a trading company is uniquely vulnerable to a loss of confidence, that once counterparties stopped dealing with Enron, the business died regardless of its underlying health, and that the accounting was approved at every stage by professional auditors and outside counsel. Lay's position was that he had delegated financial matters and been deceived by Fastow. He argued that he genuinely believed what he told employees, that he had lost most of his own fortune, and that his stock sales were forced by margin calls. The prosecution's evidence came down to three things. The cooperators, above all Fastow, who testified in detail about the partnerships and what he said senior management had known and approved. The documents, including internal analyses of the Raptors, the Watkins memo, the records of the stock sales, and the board minutes waiving the ethics code. And the defendant's own words, public statements from 2001, placed side by side with internal information available at the time. Fastow's credibility was aggressively attacked. The defense pointed out that he was a self-confessed liar and thief, testifying to reduce his own sentence and protect his wife, which was true. But he was not alone. Multiple former Enron executives testified for the government. Skilling testified in his own defense for days, and it did not go well. He was, by consistent accounts, combative and visibly irritated at being questioned. The same posture that had produced the insult on the analyst call 5 years earlier. Jurors afterwards described finding him arrogant and evasive. Lay testified too, with similar problems. He grew angry under cross-examination. He argued with the prosecutor. Jurors later said he came across as a man who believed the rules were for other people. On May 25, 2006, the jury returned its verdicts. Jeffrey Skilling, guilty on 19 counts. Conspiracy, securities fraud, false statements to auditors, insider trading. Acquitted on 9. Kenneth Lay, guilty on all 6 counts, tried before the jury. In a separate bench trial on personal banking charges, the judge found him guilty on 4 more. Sentencing was scheduled for that autumn. Skilling faced decades. Lay, at 64, faced what would very likely be the rest of his life. Outside the courthouse, former Enron employees who had lost their careers and their savings watched the two men walk to their cars. For a lot of people, that was the ending. 4.5 years after the bankruptcy, the two men at the top had been convicted by a jury of ordinary citizens in the city they had helped build and helped ruin. 6 weeks later, that ending came apart in a way nobody in the courtroom had anticipated. Chapter 24. The Man Who Beat the Verdict. After the conviction, Kenneth Lay went to Colorado. He and his wife had a property near Aspen, and they went there while his lawyers prepared appeals, and he waited for a sentencing date in October. On July 5, 2006, 6 weeks after the verdict, and roughly 3.5 months before he was due to be sentenced, Kenneth Lay died of a heart attack. He was 64. The autopsy found severe coronary artery disease, with blockages above 75% in all 3 main coronary arteries. It also revealed something not widely known during the trial. He had already suffered at least 2 previous heart attacks and had 2 stents implanted. Whatever else is true, this was a man whose heart had been failing for some time, under the most extreme stress imaginable. His death produced a revealing public reaction. Some felt sympathy, some felt he had escaped, and a good number, on the internet of 2006, simply refused to believe it, openly speculating that he had faked his own death and fled. There is no evidence for that whatsoever. The reaction itself says something, though. By 2006, a substantial portion of the American public found it easier to believe in an elaborate escape than in a corporate executive facing consequences. But the reaction wasn't the twist. In the American federal legal system, a criminal defendant has an absolute right to appeal a conviction. That right is not a courtesy. It's understood as an integral part of the process by which guilt is finally determined. A jury verdict is not the end of the road. It becomes final only after the appeal is decided, or the window to appeal closes, which raises a question the law has had to answer. What happens if a defendant dies after conviction, but before the appeal can be heard? The answer, under a long-standing doctrine applied in the Fifth Circuit and elsewhere, is a principle called abatement ab initio, Latin for, roughly, abatement from the beginning. The reasoning runs like this. The defendant had a legal right to challenge the conviction. Death has permanently removed his ability to exercise it. Therefore, the state can never establish that the conviction would have survived review. And because guilt was never conclusively established through the complete process the law requires, the conviction cannot stand. So the courts do not merely suspend it, they erase it. The conviction is vacated, and in the strictest reading the indictment itself is dismissed. The case is treated as though it had never been brought. On October 17, 2006, Judge Sim Lake, the same judge who had presided over the trial, formally vacated Kenneth Lay's conviction. Every count, the 6 from the jury, the 4 from the bench trial, gone. In the narrow sense the law recognizes, the sense that governs a criminal record, he died an innocent man. It wasn't only symbolic. Because the conviction was erased, the government's effort to recover money based on it collapsed with it. Prosecutors had been seeking roughly $43.5 million from Lay's estate, proceeds they characterized as the fruits of the fraud. With no conviction, that criminal forfeiture could not proceed. The government pursued the estate through civil channels instead, but the mechanism designed precisely to strip a fraudster of his gains was void. In fairness, abatement ab initio is not a loophole invented for Ken Lay. It's an old doctrine grounded in a real principle, that you cannot finally condemn a man who has lost the ability to defend himself. Some jurisdictions have narrowed or abandoned it since, partly because of cases like this one, where victims are left watching a verdict evaporate. The outcome here is still hard to sit with. 20,000 people lost their jobs. Between $1 and $2 billion in retirement savings disappeared. A 90-year-old accounting firm was destroyed. An entire state was manipulated into darkness. Congress passed the most sweeping corporate law reform in generations because of what this man's company did. And in the official record of the United States government, Kenneth Lay's criminal history in the Enron matter is blank. Jeffrey Skilling, who lived, was sentenced that same month to 24 years and 4 months in federal prison. The man who survived went to prison. The man who died walked away clean. Chapter 25. Where They All Went. Jeffrey Skilling served 12 years. In 2013, after years of appeals including a partial win at the Supreme Court, his sentence was cut from 24 years to 14, in a deal that released more than $40 million of his frozen assets to victims. He was released from federal custody in February 2019. He has never admitted guilt, not once, in 2 decades. He still maintains that Enron was destroyed by a market panic rather than by fraud. After his release, he began meeting former colleagues about returning to the energy business, an idea he reportedly worked out on paper while still incarcerated. He remains barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company. Andrew Fastow served roughly 6 years and was released in 2011. Then he did something almost nobody predicted. He became a professional speaker on business ethics. He speaks to business schools, corporate boards, and finance conferences. He has said he considers himself probably the person most responsible for Enron's failure, and, more interestingly, that at the time he thought of himself as a hero, as the guy solving impossible problems for the company. His argument to audiences is that he did not sit down one day and decide to commit fraud. He got there in small increments, each one defensible on its own, each one technically permitted, until the sum of them was a crime. He tells people the most dangerous phrase in business is the lawyers approved it. You can find it distasteful that the architect of the scheme now earns fees explaining it. Plenty of people do. You can also concede it's the most useful thing he could do with the rest of his life. Sharon Watkins left Enron in late 2002 and was named one of Time magazine's Persons of the Year, alongside whistleblowers at WorldCom and the FBI. She became a speaker and consultant and later taught at Texas State University. She has been candid that the practical rewards were limited. Companies were happy to hear her story as a one-way presentation, she has said, but rarely wanted her working inside their organizations. For whatever reason, she made them uncomfortable. The most famous corporate whistleblower of her generation found that the business world enjoyed her as a keynote and avoided her as a colleague. Lupi never faced criminal charges and has stayed almost entirely private. Rebecca Mark left before the collapse, was never charged, and moved on largely out of the public eye. Arthur Andersen technically still exists as a shell entity managing litigation. The firm, as an institution, is gone. Enron Field, the Houston baseball stadium that carried the company's name under a 30-year deal, was renamed in 2002. The team bought the rights back out of the bankruptcy for a few $1,000,000. Enron's headquarters tower still stands, sold and renamed and repurposed. Thousands of people work in it today. Most of them presumably do not think about it, and the creditors recovered a fraction of what was lost. The main shareholder class action, led by the regents of the University of California, eventually recovered $7.2 billion, almost all of it from banks. $2.4 billion from CIBC, the same bank that had funded the Blockbuster deal. $2.2 from J.P. Morgan Chase. $2 billion from Citigroup. $168 million from Enron's own outside directors, out of their own pockets. One of the largest securities recoveries in American history. Divide it. Around 1.5 million individuals and entities were eligible to claim. Against total investor losses, the lawyers put it something like $47 billion. Investors were expected to see somewhere between 10 and 20 cents on the dollar. Chapter 26. Why it keeps happening. Sarbanes-Oxley was supposed to be the answer. It closed the specific mechanisms. And yet, WorldCom, 2002. $11 billion of expenses misclassified as capital investment, an even larger bankruptcy than Enron, arriving before the ink on the reform bill was dry. Lehman Brothers, 2008. A firm using an accounting maneuver known as Repo 105 to temporarily move as much as $50 billion of assets off its balance sheet right before quarter-end reporting dates, according to the examiner appointed to investigate the collapse, making its leverage look smaller than it was. If that sounds familiar, it should. Same instinct as Fastow's SPEs, executed differently. Move the ugly thing off the page on the day the photograph is taken. Theranos. A company valued at its peak at a figure widely reported as $9 billion, on the strength of a technology that did not work, sustained by an extraordinarily prestigious board, credulous press coverage, and a founder whose certainty was so total that investors treated it as evidence. The FTX, 2022, a crypto exchange valued at $32 billion, with celebrity endorsements, a founder on magazine covers, and customer funds flowing through affiliated entities in ways nobody outside could see. And the story closes a circle almost too neat to be real. The restructuring executive brought in to run FTX through its bankruptcy wrote in a court filing that in 40 years of doing this work, he had never encountered such a complete failure of corporate controls, or such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information. His name is John Ray. 21 years earlier, he had been the man brought in to run Enron through its bankruptcy. The person who cleaned up Enron looked at FTX and said it was worse. Every one of these has the same skeleton, and it isn't the accounting. 5 things recur. A story too good to check. A business so novel that outsiders can't evaluate it and stop trying. Enron. We've turned energy into a financial market. Theranos. We've reinvented blood testing. FTX. We've built the future of finance. When the story is complicated enough, admitting you don't understand it feels like admitting you're not smart enough. So nobody admits it. Profits that don't turn into cash. It's the most reliable warning sign in corporate finance. It sits in public filings available to anyone who looks, and it gets ignored every time because the profits are exciting and the cash flow statement is at the back. Gatekeepers on the payroll. FTX did its own version through sponsorships, endorsements, and a reputation laundered by association. A culture that punishes the question. Rank and yank was an unusually literal version, but every one of these companies had some mechanism for making internal skepticism expensive. And leaders who believe it themselves. This is the one people underrate. The most dangerous person in a company like this is not a cynical liar. It's a true believer who has convinced himself that the future he can see so clearly is close enough to the present that reporting it early isn't really lying. Which leaves one conclusion that survives contact with the evidence. Enron was not a bug. It was a demonstration of what a set of ordinary, Widely available incentives will do when nobody interrupts them. Every individual piece of it was legal and unremarkable. Enron just ran all of them at once, at maximum, for 10 years, with no breaks. The reason it will happen again is not that we forgot the lesson. It's that the conditions that produced it are the ordinary conditions of doing business, and the only thing standing between a normal company and an Enron is a small number of people, at various levels, choosing to ask a question that will cost them something. Chapter 27. The $275 punchline. One last thing, because this story has an ending nobody could have written. On December 2nd, 2024, 23 years to the day after the bankruptcy filing, billboards appeared around Houston. A full-page advertisement ran in the Houston Chronicle. A slick corporate video went online, full of skylines and rocket launches and swelling music. The message was 2 words: "We're back." Enron had a new website, a new logo, a new set of corporate values, and a press release about leveraging cutting-edge technology and human ingenuity to solve the world's energy challenges. It also had a new chief executive, a 28-year-old named Connor Gatos, whose previous claim to fame was co-creating Birds Aren't Real, a satirical conspiracy theory arguing that the government replaced all the birds with surveillance drones, invented specifically to demonstrate how easily absurd claims spread. Buried in the site's terms was a disclaimer explaining that the whole thing is First Amendment-protected parody, for entertainment purposes only. The trademark to the name Enron had been bought in 2020 by an LLC connected to Gatos for $275, a company once valued at roughly $70 billion, a name that destroyed an accounting firm, took an entire state's power grid hostage, and changed federal law. $275. Within days, Gatos was hit in the face with a pie while entering a building in New York, which was itself an echo. A woman had thrown a pie at the real Jeff Skilling more than 2 decades earlier. Then came the product launch. At a staged press event, with a completely straight face, the company unveiled the Enron Egg, described as the world's first micronuclear reactor for residential suburban use, capable of powering a family home for a decade. It went viral instantly, and a meaningful number of people believed it. You can find this tasteless. Many people did, particularly in Houston, particularly among those who lost their retirement. That reaction is completely fair. But look at what the joke is doing, because it's sharper than it first appears. The parody works by doing precisely what the real Enron did: a confident press release, a beautiful video, a bold vision, a technology that doesn't exist, and a mission statement full of words like innovation and ingenuity, then letting the polish do the persuading. And people believed it. In 2024, about Enron, the most infamous corporate fraud in American history, whose name is a synonym for lying to investors, announced a fictional home nuclear reactor, and a meaningful number of people took it seriously, which is, on reflection, the most honest monument this story could have. Because the original Enron's greatest achievement was never the accounting. It was the packaging, the confidence, the certainty that made analysts nod along to a business none of them could describe, and made employees put their life savings into a stock because a man on a stage told them it was cheap. 23 years later, someone bought the name for the price of a used laptop, put out a press release, and proved the trick still works. 6 years running, Fortune magazine named this company America's most innovative. And the thing that should genuinely unsettle you, because it's the true version and not the satisfying one, is that they weren't wrong. Enron was innovative, ferociously, historically innovative. The gas bank was a real invention that permanently changed how energy is bought and sold in this country. Bandwidth trading and streaming video were correct predictions made years early. Fastow's structures were, as pieces of financial engineering, admired by professionals before anyone understood what they were for. Enron's innovation was completely real. It was just pointed at the wrong thing. Every ounce of that intelligence went into one project, making a number appear on a page that had no corresponding fact in the world. And the reason nobody stopped it is not that everyone was corrupt. It's that at every checkpoint, the auditor, the analyst, the director, the banker, the reporter, the employee, the question, how does this actually work, was expensive to ask and free to skip. Skipping it cost 20,000 people their jobs and their retirements, and took an entire state's power grid down with them. The next one is being built right now. It has a great story, a chart that only goes up, a founder people describe as a genius, and a set of numbers that nobody outside the building can fully explain. The only question that has ever caught one of these in time is the boring one. The one a 31-year-old reporter asked in 2001 and got hung up on for asking. How, exactly, does this company make money? If nobody can answer that in plain English, not the analysts, not the auditors, not the chief executive, you already have your answer.